The gate is padlocked, and there are no signs. Just a dirt road, a ridge of pale limestone, and 5 red cows standing perfectly still in the heat. No cameras, no live stream, no press release. Just a handler in plain clothes, walking the fence line at dusk, counting them the way a man counts something he cannot afford to lose. Somewhere behind him, folded in a drawer in Jerusalem, sit blueprints. Not sketches, not renderings for a museum. Architectural plans, stamped, measured, ready. 2 things that were never supposed to exist at the same time in human history. A red heifer without blemish and a finished plan for the house that requires her ashes. Now exist in the same country, in the same season, within driving distance of each other. Nobody is talking about this on the evening news. Somebody is talking about it in a room with no windows. And once you understand why those 2 things cannot exist apart from each other, you will never look at a news cycle the same way again. Because this isn't a story about cattle. It's a story about a 2,000-year silence that may be ending. For 2,000 years, there has been a hole in the middle of Jewish religious law. Not a small one, a structural one. The law says a certain kind of purification must happen before certain sacred things can resume. And the ingredient for that purification, an unblemished red heifer, sacrificed and burned outside the camp, simply has not existed. Not because nobody wanted one, because it is almost biologically impossible to produce. 1 white hair, 1 black hair, 1 hair that isn't red. That's all it takes to disqualify her. For centuries, that impossibility was almost a mercy. It meant a certain door stayed shut. It meant a certain countdown stayed paused. 5 heifers now stand in a guarded pasture. And men who have devoted their lives to this subject believe at least one of them may qualify. That alone would be enough for a headline. It is not enough for what is actually happening. Because somewhere else, in a different building, men have already drawn the house those ashes are for. I want you to sit with that for a second before we go anywhere else. Not the heifers alone, not the blueprints alone, the 2 of them, together, in the same window of time. That is the part almost nobody is connecting. That is the part we are going to walk through. Slowly, tonight. Because when the ingredient and the instructions arrive in the same season, after 2,000 years of neither one existing, that is not coincidence in the way you and I usually use that word. It is closer to a lock finally meeting its key. I'm not asking you to panic. I'm asking you to pay attention. There is a difference between those 2 things. And by the end of this, you'll know exactly which one this deserves. Somewhere in Israel tonight, a man is checking on cattle the way other men check on a countdown clock. And somewhere else, a drawing sits in a drawer, waiting for a green light that may already be closer than anyone is saying out loud. We are going to start at the beginning. An old law, an old ash, an old silence. Then we are going to follow it all the way to a set of leaked plans that should not exist yet. But do. Stay with me. Because once you see how these 2 threads were tied together 3,000 years ago, you will understand exactly why they are surfacing again now, in your lifetime, not someone else's. This is the story of the red heifer, and the house she was always meant to open the door to understand why 5 cows in a fenced field matter more than most wars you've watched on the news. You have to go back to a book most people skim past. The book of Numbers, chapter 19. Buried in the middle of instructions about camps and cleanliness sits a command that sounds, on the surface, almost strange. Take a red heifer, without defect, without blemish, one that has never worn a yoke. Slaughter her outside the camp. Burn her completely. Hide flesh, blood, even the dung, until nothing remains but ash. Mix that ash with water. And that mixture, and only that mixture, becomes the one thing capable of purifying a person who has come into contact with death. Not sin in the moral sense. Death itself. Contact with a corpse. In the ancient world, that contact was considered the deepest form of impurity a person could carry, and impurity mattered, because it determined who could enter the sacred space and who could not. Without the ashes of the red heifer, that door simply did not open. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a mechanism, a functioning, physical, procedural key. Now here's the detail almost no one outside religious scholarship ever sits with. According to Jewish tradition, only a small number of these heifers have ever existed across the entire span of biblical and post-biblical history. Some counts put the number at 9, spanning from the days of Moses to the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. 9 in over 1,000 years. Since that destruction, nothing. Not one. Not for nearly 2,000 years. Why does that matter? Because the ashes from the last heifer were used up long ago. Which means, according to the very law that requires them, anyone entering certain sacred areas today is doing so in a state the law itself calls impure. That has been the quiet, unspoken condition of that ground for 2 millennia. A closed loop, a law with no key, a sacred site, functionally sealed by its own sacred rules. This is why, for 2,000 years, the absence of a red heifer wasn't just an agricultural inconvenience. It was, in a strange way, a kind of restraint built into history itself. As long as the ashes didn't exist, a certain sequence could not formally begin. Groups have tried for decades to breed one. Programs in Israel and quietly funded efforts from abroad have raised red cattle for generations, checking every calf against an impossibly narrow standard. Most fail before their first birthday. A single strand of the wrong color hair, and the calf is disqualified for life. This is not folklore. This is documented, active breeding work, conducted with rabbinical inspectors present at every stage. And for years, it produced almost nothing usable. Then, not long ago, that changed. 5 heifers, raised under religious supervision, reached an age and a condition that specialists in this field had not seen in living memory. The silence that held for 2,000 years had a crack in it. And once a silence like that cracks, it rarely closes back up quietly. So where does that crack stand right now in the summer of 2026? Not in theory, not in prophecy blogs, in the actual physical world, on actual land, with actual animals that someone is actually responsible for keeping alive and unblemished for one more season. The current situation centers on a small herd, raised and monitored under a partnership between an American cattle supply effort and religious authorities connected to the movement working toward temple restoration. Reports place the animals at a secured location associated with the region near Shiloh, chosen deliberately. Shiloh itself carries its own weight in this story, as an earlier resting place of the Ark before Jerusalem. Security around the herd isn't dramatic in the way a movie would stage it. It's quiet, controlled access, a short list of people permitted near the animals at all. Handlers trained specifically to avoid anything that could cause a blemish. No rough fencing, no branding, nothing that could leave a scar or cause hair to grow in the wrong color. Even a wound that heals white can end the process instantly. That is how narrow this margin is. Age matters here in a way that creates real urgency. The traditional requirement is that the heifer be at minimum a certain age of maturity, but not so old that specific physical changes disqualify her. That window is not wide. It closes, which means 2026 is being treated by the people closest to this effort as a hard deadline rather than a soft one. Miss this window with these 5 animals, and the next viable window could be years away. Rabbinical inspectors reportedly examine the herd on a recurring basis, checking coat color under natural light at different times of day, since even reflected light can create the appearance of an off-color hair that later proves to be nothing. It is meticulous. It is almost unbearably careful. And it is being done right now, without press conferences, without live-streamed updates, without anyone outside a small circle knowing the day-to-day status. That secrecy is deliberate, and it tells you something on its own. When a project believes it is simply agricultural, it doesn't need this level of discretion. When a project understands that it may be the final missing piece in a 2,000-year-old sequence, discretion becomes protection. Protection from interference. Protection from premature attention. Protection, frankly, from the kind of scrutiny that could jeopardize the animals themselves, given how contested this ground already is. People who have followed this effort for years describe a shift in tone recently. Less, we are attempting something, and more, we are managing something that is close. That distinction, small as it sounds, is the whole story compressed into a sentence. For 2,000 years, the posture was attempt. Right now, on the ground, the posture has quietly become management. And management implies an outcome that is expected, not merely hoped for. That alone would be worth your attention, but it is only half of what is converging in this single window of time. Because while a small circle manages the animals, a different circle has been managing something else entirely. The physical plans for the structure those ashes exist to purify a path toward, and those plans did not stay as contained as the people who drew them intended. Now we move to the second half of this convergence. The part that turns a story about livestock into a story about architecture, engineering, and a building the world has debated for 2,000 years without anyone actually having a plan for it in hand. That changed. Digital renderings and structural documents connected to Third Temple reconstruction efforts have circulated in recent seasons among specific religious and engineering circles, and portions of that material have leaked further than intended. What makes these documents different from the artistic renderings that have floated around for decades is specificity. These aren't inspirational paintings meant to stir emotion. These read like construction documents. Measurements, material callouts, load calculations, phased assembly sequences. That is a different category of object entirely. An oil painting of the temple asks you to imagine. A construction document asks a contractor to build. The material reportedly draws on modular construction methodology, a building approach where large structural components are fabricated off-site, in pieces, then transported and assembled rapidly on location. This matters enormously given the site in question. The Temple Mount is among the most politically sensitive parcels of land on Earth. A traditional, years-long construction timeline with visible daily work, scaffolding, and open excavation would be almost impossible to execute without immediate international incident. A modular approach solves that problem in a way that should unsettle anyone who has studied the region's history. Components built and tested elsewhere, foundations prepared with minimal visible disruption, final assembly compressed into the shortest possible physical window. Some analyses of the leaked material suggest an assembly phase measured in a small number of weeks once components are staged, rather than the years the world has always assumed such a project would require. Weeks, not years. The interior specifications are where this becomes almost eerie in its precision. The layout maps to the ancient measurements described in Ezekiel's temple vision and in the specifications preserved by the Temple Institute for generations. The inner sanctum, the outer court, the placement of the altar, all rendered in units that correspond to a cubit-based system rather than a modern one, and yet layered into those ancient measurements are unmistakably modern integrations, structured provisions for climate control, electrical routing paths concealed within traditional stone-facing elements, security and access control considerations built into gate placement from the earliest design stage, not added afterward. This is not a museum piece. It is not a replica intended for display. It is a working building, designed to function, on a site that currently holds one of the most contested religious structures on the planet. The tension in that single sentence is the entire geopolitical weight of this era, held in one paragraph. A structure engineered to be assembled in weeks, sitting in drawer form, on a plot of land where the wrong afternoon of construction could ignite a regional crisis. That is not a hypothetical anymore. That is a documented set of plans in circulation among people with both the motive and, increasingly, the capability to act on them. The question was never really, could this be built? Modern engineering solved that question decades ago. The question has always been timing and permission, and a world willing to look away long enough for the first foundation stone to be set. And that is exactly where the next thread of this story picks up. Because permission on that specific piece of land has always been the hardest variable of all. Until recently, it has been treated as immovable. It no longer looks quite that immovable. The ground beneath all of this, literally and politically, is the Temple Mount, and specifically the fragile arrangement known as the status quo, which has governed that 35-acre plateau since 1967. Under that arrangement, a Jewish prayer has been restricted, and religious authority over the site has remained, on paper, with the Jordanian-run Islamic Waqf. It is one of the most carefully balanced diplomatic arrangements on Earth, precisely because everyone involved understands what happens if it breaks. That balance has been shifting quietly in ways that rarely make international front pages, but that regional analysts track closely. Visits by Israeli officials to the compound have increased in both frequency and visibility over recent years. Legislative proposals inside the Knesset addressing sovereignty and prayer rights at the site's surface with growing regularity, no longer treated as fringe positions, but as mainstream political conversation. Each of these, individually, looks like ordinary political friction. Together, they read like erosion, the slow wearing away of an arrangement that was never designed to last forever, only to last long enough. Archaeological work near and beneath the compound has also accelerated. Excavations in the tunnels and plazas surrounding the site, framed publicly as historical preservation and tourism infrastructure, have in several instances exposed structural elements directly relevant to Temple-era foundations. Whether or not that work is connected in any formal sense to reconstruction planning, it has the practical effect of mapping exactly what lies beneath the current structures. Information any future construction effort would require. You do not need a stated conspiracy for these efforts to converge. You need only overlapping interests, moving on separate timelines that happen to be arriving at the same destination. That is precisely what regional observers describe when they look at the last several years in aggregate. Internationally, reactions remain fractured in a way that itself signals how much has changed. A decade ago, any serious movement toward altering the status quo would have triggered immediate, unified condemnation across the region. Today, several governments that would once have led that condemnation are consumed by their own internal instability, economic pressure, or realigned strategic priorities elsewhere. The coalition that once stood ready to enforce the old arrangement is thinner than it has been in generations. Religious nationalist movements within Israel, meanwhile, have grown more organized, better funded, and more willing to speak openly about temple restoration as a near-term political goal rather than a distant theological aspiration. That shift in language, from someday to soon, is not rhetorical accident. It reflects an actual shift in what these movements believe is politically achievable within the current environment. None of this guarantees an outcome on any particular date. History does not move on anyone's convenient schedule, and men have declared soon before, only to watch decades pass. But something has changed in the structural conditions surrounding that plateau. The diplomatic coalition guarding the status quo has weakened. The excavation and mapping work has advanced, and the political language around restoration has hardened from hope into plan. Combine that with a physical set of construction documents built for rapid, minimal footprint assembly, and a herd of animals reaching maturity under a careful guard 2 hours away. 3 separate developments, 3 separate timelines, arriving, improbably, in the same narrow window. That convergence is what we turn to next, because it does not stop at politics and architecture. It reaches all the way down into the people being quietly trained to walk through that door the moment it opens. Now let me step back from the blueprints and the politics for a moment, because none of this means anything if it stays out there at a distance, as something happening to other people in another country, on a schedule none of us control. It doesn't stay out there. Not really. If you have ever read the book of Revelation and felt that quiet tightening in your chest. Not fear exactly, something closer to recognition. This is why. Because prophecy was never given to be admired from a safe distance, like a painting behind glass. It was given to be lived inside of, by ordinary people, in ordinary bodies, in years that felt just as normal to them as this one feels to you. The people alive when the Second Temple fell in the year 70 did not know they were living through the exact event Christ had described decades earlier. They just knew their world was changing faster than anyone had prepared them for. That is what this moment asks of you. Not analysis, not a prediction you post online and forget by next week. Recognition. The recognition that you were not born in a random century, reading about this the way you'd read about ancient Rome. You were born into the specific stretch of history when a red heifer without blemish and a finished blueprint for the Third Temple exist on the same plot of land, in the same season, within a 2-hour drive of each other. That is not something every generation of believers got to say. Most of them waited their entire lives and never saw either piece arrive, let alone both. I don't say that to alarm you. I say it because I think most of us go through our days treating the end times as background noise. Something referenced in a sermon, mentioned in passing, filed away as someday. And then a week like this one arrives, and the filing cabinet doesn't hold anymore. You start to feel the weight of living inside the chapter, rather than reading about it from outside. That feeling is not a malfunction in you. It is not anxiety you need to manage away. It is closer to what Scripture calls being awake rather than asleep. While everyone around you assumes the night will simply go on forever. So here is the honest question underneath everything we've covered so far tonight. Not, when will this happen? Nobody alive can answer that with certainty. and anyone who claims otherwise is selling you something. The honest question is quieter than that. Are you living like someone who understands what season this is? Or are you living like someone still waiting for a more convenient time to pay attention? That question doesn't require you to panic, quit your job, or post a countdown online. It asks something smaller and harder. That you stop treating this as content and start treating it as your actual life, happening in your actual lifetime. The heifers are being watched. The blueprints are being finished. And somewhere in Jerusalem right now, there are men being trained for a role no one has filled in 2,000 years, which is exactly where we're going next. Here is the piece almost nobody watching this from the outside has considered. And it may be the most unsettling detail in the entire picture, because it isn't about stone or cattle at all. It's about men. For sacrifices to resume, you don't only need a sanctified structure and purifying ash. You need priests, specifically men who can trace unbroken lineage back to Aaron, trained and prepared to perform duties that have not been carried out in almost 2,000 years. That sounds, on its face, like an impossible requirement. Who keeps a genealogy that precise across 2 millennia of exile, dispersion, and displacement? The answer is that a surprising number of families do. Kohanim status has been preserved, generation after generation. Within specific Jewish families, through tradition, surname, and communal record, treated not as trivia, but as sacred inheritance to be guarded and passed down deliberately. For years, an organization known as the Temple Institute has worked quietly and meticulously to prepare for the moment that status becomes operational rather than ceremonial. They have commissioned and completed the sacred vessels described in Exodus and Leviticus, the golden menorah, the silver trumpets, the priestly garments woven to exact specification, the incense altar, the laver for ritual washing. These are not replicas sitting behind museum glass for tourists. They are described by those involved as functional, ready for use, awaiting only the structure and the sanctioned occasion to be employed as originally intended. Alongside the vessels, a smaller and far less publicized effort has continued. The identification and quiet training of men who carry confirmed Kohanim lineage, walking them through the specific purification rites, dress, and procedural knowledge required to function in priestly service. This training does not happen in public. It happens in study rooms, in small groups, without press coverage, treated with the same discretion as the cattle 2 hours away. And this is where the two threads of this entire story finally, fully intersect. Because the ash of the red heifer is not simply symbolic. In the framework these groups operate under, it is described as the specific mechanism required to purify the priests themselves before they can enter into service. Without that ash, the men can be trained, the garments can be woven, the vessels can be polished and ready, and none of it can be legally activated. The heifer's ash functions, in that specific religious framework, as the final key in a chain that has sat locked for 2,000 years. Every other piece of this puzzle can be prepared in advance. This piece cannot be substituted, faked, or approximated, which is exactly why 5 cattle standing quietly in a guarded field carry more weight than any blueprint, any political shift, or any excavation on their own. Vessels, prepared. Garments, woven. Priests, identified and in training. Structure, designed, down to modular assembly sequences. Only one ingredient in that entire chain has been missing for 2 millennia, and it may no longer be missing much longer. Sit with that structure for a moment. Every other piece assembled and waiting, arranged around a single missing key that history is now quietly producing. That is not a loose collection of interesting facts. That is a mechanism, nearly complete. And mechanisms do not stay incomplete forever once every other part has already been built. So let's pull every thread we've walked through tonight into a single, unbroken line. Because held separately, each piece can be argued away as coincidence. Held together, they stop behaving like coincidence at all. A 2,000-year absence of the red heifer, which functioned as a kind of built-in restraint on the entire sequence, has narrowed to 5 animals under careful guard, approaching the exact window their handlers consider final. A set of construction documents for the third temple, specific enough to read as buildable rather than aspirational, engineered for rapid modular assembly on one of the most politically sensitive parcels of land on the planet, has surfaced and circulated beyond its intended audience. The diplomatic coalition that has protected the status quo on that exact parcel for over half a century has visibly thinned, distracted by its own internal pressures, while religious nationalist political language inside Israel has shifted from someday to soon. The sacred vessels required for priestly service have already been completed and stand ready. Men with confirmed priestly lineage are already being trained, quietly, in the specific rites that service requires. Every piece of that chain, individually, could be dismissed as a niche religious news item, easily lost in a single news cycle dominated by other stories. Together, they describe something closer to staging, the kind of quiet, coordinated readiness that precedes an event rather than merely discusses it. This is not a claim that a date has been set. No date has been set, and Scripture itself is notably careful to withhold that specific knowledge from anyone. But staging is not the same as prediction. Staging is observable. Staging is what happens in the years just before a threshold, not on the threshold itself. And what we are describing tonight, across cattle pastures, architectural drawings, parliamentary debates, and quiet training rooms, reads as staging on every front simultaneously. Consider how differently this reads to different eyes. To someone entirely outside any faith tradition, this is simply a fascinating convergence of religious nationalism, archaeology, and political tension in one of the world's most contested regions. Worth watching as a geopolitical flashpoint, regardless of any theological framework. To a devout Jew awaiting the rebuilding of the temple as the restoration of covenant worship, this is the most significant convergence of preparatory signs in living memory. And to a Christian reading these events through the lens of Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians, and the book of Revelation, this reads as something more specific still. The rebuilding of a structure that, according to that framework, becomes central to events described as unfolding in the final chapter of human history before Christ's return. 3 very different lenses, the same physical facts, sitting underneath all 3. That is precisely why this convergence carries weight even for those who approach it with caution rather than certainty. I am not asking you to adopt any one specific timeline. I am asking you to notice that the pieces which prophecy long described as necessary preconditions, a functioning priesthood, prepared vessels, purification restored, and a structure to house it all, are for the first time in 2,000 years no longer purely theoretical. They are, in varying stages, physically assembled, physically trained, and physically drawn. That is the difference between reading about a chapter and realizing you are standing inside its opening page. The next 18 months, by the estimation of people closest to this effort, represent the narrowest and most consequential window this convergence has produced in generations. Whatever else that window holds, it will not hold silence for much longer. There is a version of this conversation that ends in fear. And I want to be honest with you about why I'm not going to leave you there. Fear treats the ending of a story as the worst part. But if you have read to the final pages of Revelation rather than stopping in the middle chapters, you already know the ending isn't the sacrifice, the temple, or even the tribulation. The ending is a wedding, a restoration, a voice saying plainly that every tear gets wiped away, and that the one who was slain before the foundation of the world sits, finally without rival, on the throne this entire sequence has always been circling toward. The heifers, the blueprints, the priests in training, the shifting borders of a small plateau in Jerusalem. None of that is the point. It is only the doorway. And doorways, by their nature, are meant to be walked through, not stood in front of forever. So here is what I actually want to leave you with tonight. Not a date. Not a countdown you can post online and check off day by day. A posture. The kind of posture the wise virgins carried in that parable, oil already in their lamps, not because they knew the exact hour, but because they refused to be caught treating the weight as permanent. You do not need to know when the last heifer is confirmed, or when the first stone of that structure is set, to live like a person who is already awake. You only need to stop assuming you have unlimited time to decide what you believe about the one this whole sequence has always pointed toward. The animals in that field will either qualify or they won't. The blueprints will either become stone or they will stay paper. Those outcomes are not yours to control, and they were never meant to be. What is yours to control is smaller, and in another sense, larger than all of it combined. Whether you spend this season half asleep, waiting for a more convenient time to take any of this seriously, or whether you let a week like this one do exactly what it's meant to do, wake you up, not to panic, to clarity. There is a difference between those two, and only one of them was ever the goal. I'm not going to tell you what to feel walking away from this. I'm only going to tell you that I felt it too. Putting this together, that particular quiet that settles in when something you always filed under someday quietly relabels itself now. Sit with that. Don't rush past it for the sake of comfort. If this reached you tonight, don't let it end in this room alone. Follow this channel, because what happens on that plateau over the next 18 months will not wait for anyone's convenience. And I intend to keep watching it closely with you. Send this to 5 people who need to hear it, not to alarm them, but because silence has never once made anyone more ready. Leave a comment and tell me honestly what part of this actually reached you tonight, and not just what you think you're supposed to say. And tell me what you want me to dig into next. Because there is far more to this convergence than 18 minutes can hold. The ash has been missing for 2,000 years. It may not be missing much longer.